Okay, now we're on the record. So welcome everybody back, and welcome Mr. Fulford and Ms. DeYoung to the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment. This is our opportunity to meet with you, the team of Orogo, and have you provide us just basically, well, the presentation before us is the mandate and activities of Orogo, and so that's well appreciated. I apologize, this is long overdue. We would have loved to have had you in here much sooner, and we hope that doesn't take as long in the future, and possibly we can meet on an annual basis. But without further ado, maybe what I'll do, just for the record, I'll get committee to introduce themselves, and I'll start on my far left.
Hi, welcome. My name is Herb Nekamak from Nunukput. Welcome.
Danny McNeely, Santee Region. Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
RJ Simpson, MLA, Hay River North.
And I'm Cory Vanthuyne, MLA for Yellowknife North, and the chair of the Economic Development and Environment Committee. And we also have with us today from research Gustavo Oliveira, and from the clerk's office, Mr. Michael Ball. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Fulford, to introduce yourself, and any opening comments, and the presentation is yours. Thank you. Oh, and just further information for your information is you're not required to touch the mic at all. We'll, the exchange of conversation will go through me, and every time you address me, then our technician, Indio, knows when to turn the mics on and off for you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the introduction to brief the committee. Certainly we're appreciative of the opportunity to brief the committee. We haven't had the chance in this government to brief committees, so we think it's important that we're able to update the legislators on the work of our office, and we are looking forward to doing so. So by way of introduction, on my left, your right, is Pauline DeYoung, who's the Senior Legislative Advisor, Legislation and Policy of Orogo, who will be maybe stepping in during the presentation if I miss something. And maybe I'll just propose that unless you have another convention, that you just interrupt me if you have any questions about the subject matter of the presentation, and I'll stop and we can address them. Does that work, or do you wait until the end?
Yeah, typically we wait until the end.
Okay.
So thank you. We'll let you carry on, and we'll save questions until the end.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That works equally well for us. If
there's a need at any point, just let me know if there's a need to switch over to who is speaking, so that, again, it can come through the chair accordingly. Thank you, Mr.
Chair. So beginning on the second slide of the presentation entitled Background, just a background on the establishment of Orogo. Our office, as I think is known to everyone around the table, was established with devolution. But unlike most other devolved areas, it did not involve a transfer of existing staff. So with land staff, those staff that were acting for the federal government, they became territorial government employees. With us, there was no staff at all, so we had to staff up from the ground up. The current regulator was appointed by cabinet order in February of 2016, and as you know, that's the Minister of Justice. Prior to that, it was the Minister of ITI. And there were two different ministers of ITI during that period, one of whom was also the Premier, but prior to that, it was the Minister of ITI, David Ramsey. The office was established to support the regulatory decision-making functions of the regulator, as well as other regulatory decision-makers under the Oil and Gas Operations Act. And those other two regulatory decision-makers are the Conservation Officer and the Chief Safety Officer. And I've been designated the Chief Conservation Officer, and we can talk a little bit about that later on in the presentation. The office is functionally separate from the Department of Justice, in which we are housed, in keeping with the arm's length nature of decision making. That was also true when we were housed within the Department of ITI, although the decision was made that given the mandate of ITI, it was somewhat arguably inconsistent with having an independent regulator housed within a department that also had a resource promotional function. So now we're in Justice. Justice does not have that resource promotional function. So our interaction with the Department of Justice is mainly limited to corporate functions like finance and IT and the like. Turning to the next slide, mandate. It's important to note, well, I'll start off with the first bullet there. The regulator's statutory mandate is set out in the Oil and Gas Operations Act, and that is to ensure human safety, first and foremost, to protect the environment, and to conserve oil and gas resources. And when we say conserve there, we don't mean in the environmental sense, we mean in the sense of making sure they're not wasted because they're a public resource. It's very important to note that the promotion of oil and gas activity is not a part of our mandate. So we're basically ambivalent as to whether development occurs. Our role is to make sure that if activity occurs, that it occurs in a way that ensures human safety and protects the environment and conserves the resource. So that's not always clear to people. They don't always draw the distinction between us and the Petroleum Resources Division of ITI or other promotional functions within the government. So over the past 4 years, actually, we've been taking great pains to ensure that that distinction is understood. And I'll also add that the acts that govern our activities are the Petroleum Resources Act, in addition to the Oil and Gas Operations Act and the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act. And our role is carried out in addition to the roles of other regulators, including the Land and Water Boards of the Mackenzie Valley. So often there's a misapprehension as well that when it's oil and gas, the other regulators are swept aside and it's only us. But the actual fact is that we are layered on top of those other processes just because of the uniqueness of oil and gas activity. Moving on to the next slide. The slide has a map of our jurisdiction, and it's set out in green on this map. It includes the onshore Northwest Territories, except the Inuvialuit settlement area, and also excluding federal areas that were retained with devolution. The most significant of those areas retained by Canada is the Norman Wells proven area. And you can see there's an inset there, and it closely surrounds Norman Wells. And that continues to be regulated by the National Energy Board under federal legislation. Just to complicate matters, in the ISR, when the NEB is regulating, it's actually regulating under territorial legislation. So when you hear about these changes that are being made to the petroleum legislation, the PRA, and OGOA, the NEB will be implementing those in the ISR. So it'll be territorial legislation passed by this assembly that'll be telling the NEB what to do. It's somewhat of a unique circumstance in Canada that came out of the devolution agreement. And just to give a southern reference, not that anyone here necessarily needs one, but the green area is roughly comparable to the size of British Columbia. Turning on to the slide entitled Responsibilities. So all oil and gas activities require authorization by the regulator. And on the left side of the slide, there's a list of the primary regulatory functions of the regulator as supported by our office. Those, anytime anyone wants to drill a well, we have to issue an operation authorization and a well approval. We do inspections once we've authorized that activity. We have an inspection team of 2 persons that can be augmented by contracted assistance. We fulfill incident response. Should there be an incident, we are responsible for managing that response. And we issue guidelines and interpretation notes under the Act that help clarify the requirements. On the right-hand side of the slide, you see issuing significant discovery and commercial discovery declarations. That happens under the Petroleum Resources Act, and you might have heard quite a bit about this, these large significant discovery licenses that were issued in the Sawtooth in the Canol Shale. So the underlying declaration that resulted in that license, we're the ones who made the technical determination upon which that license was built. And you may now or will soon be hearing about changes that ITI is proposing to, in the future, limit the size of those. Just to add one further comment on responsibilities, I'll just say that in practice, all day-to-day regulatory decision-making has been delegated to the Chief Conservation Officer. So that's me with the assistance of my staff in the office. So the Minister of Justice and Regulator, the Honourable Lou Siebert, is not in his office making decisions on well drilling or well abandonment. That has all been delegated to our office. Turning on to the next slide. entitled Strategic Plan. This is just a graphical representation of the strategic plan that governs our office. So in addition to the roles set out in legislation, we've established and received the regulator's approval of a strategic plan to guide our activities as an organization. And our mission is based closely on our statutory mandate, and our 4 key strategic objectives establish the lens through which we look at our prioritize our work. So just quickly to step through those strategic objectives, you have enhanced certainty and predictability in our actions and regulatory decisions, promote accessibility and transparency in our work, build and maintain resilient working relationships, and grow oil and gas regulatory capacity in the Northwest Territories. I can tell you that all of Orogo staff are highly motivated to demonstrate the benefits of devolution. We're not interested in being a middleman for expertise from the south. We're highly motivated to develop in-house expertise both within Orogo and within other regulators. There's not as high a level of comfort with regulating oil and gas as there is with, say, mining, which has a long history, especially in this area of the Northwest Territories. So we think over the past 4 years, we've made significant progress in demonstrating our competence as a regulator, in being accessible, and importantly to us, being responsive to the public that we serve. The next slide is a slide on Orogo's resourcing history. So just a few words on this. As of devolution, after they did the organizational planning for devolution and planned for where the functions were going to be, they based their projections on the projected activity at that time, and Orogo was established with a budget of approximately $2.2 million and 8 staff members. In 2016-17, and I think that was that before the life of this assembly?
During. It was during.
So we were still housed in ITI, and at that time there was a budget reduction exercises that resulted in Orogo's budget being reduced by approximately $350,000, which included 2 unfilled positions. So our budget currently sits at roughly $1.87 million. Moving on to the next slide, and this is just an org chart that sets out the people in our office. As mentioned, there's 6 of us, not including the regulator, who's the Minister of Justice. And then quickly turning on to the next page, you see the actual people that fill out the boxes. A recent picture of us, and I'll just do a quick introduction to these people. Kristen Cameron, who's the manager of our information office, is found on the left. Donna Shear, our office administrator. Misha Maliko, who's currently on a transfer assignment to infrastructure, but whose position is currently being backfilled by Ed Hardy of the WSCC, someone who has a lot of field experience as well. There's myself, Pauline, who's already been introduced, and on the far right, Brian Happel, Senior Technical Advisor and Chief Safety Officer. So the field team that I was referring to is comprised of Brian Happel and currently Ed Hardy or Misha Maliko. And from time to time, me or other members of the office also get into the field to observe. As Chief Conservation Officer, I also have powers that I can use to direct companies to do things that they need to do in the area of conservation. The next slide is entitled Service Agreements. So the size of the office, obviously, there's 6 of us, and the current level of activity means that it is impracticable for us to maintain the level of technical expertise on hand necessary for all aspects of oil and gas regulation. So we are able to access the expertise of technical professionals from the AER and the National Energy Board under service agreements that we have under both of those agreements, and they're on a fee-for-service basis. And so when we're accessing that expertise, we're doing it without accessing the policy baggage, if I can call it that, of either of those 2 organizations. We're accessing, Joe Blow, PEng or petroleum engineer, and getting his best advice on how we should approach something, because our legislation is also very different than either of those 2 jurisdictions. So that's been very helpful to us, and those service agreements will remain in place for the foreseeable future. We've also, from time to time, gone out and sought other outside expertise. We've done a request for qualifications and being able to track who is available in the north to do this kind of work. So we have an inventory of that as well. Further, as indicated in the strategic plan, one of our key focuses is developing oil and gas regulatory capacity in ourselves and others. So that's always our focus. We don't want to be reliant on these bodies forever. We're trying to develop our internal expertise. There's some areas where it's just at the current levels, it's just not reasonably foreseeable that we're going to be able to develop that highly technical expertise. But in general, I'd say the last 4 years have seen us become a lot more independent in the exercise of our oil and gas regulatory responsibilities. So turning the page to MOUs, I call it. Another of the focuses over the past several years has been to formalize relationships with other regulators and government departments. And we've done this through a series of MOUs. And part of the reason for that is to ensure that the relationships that we have now will survive things like future staff changes. As I'm sure everyone around the table is aware, it's an issue in the GNWT in the north generally that there's a lot of movement. You know, people stay in jobs for a relatively brief period of time. We want to make sure that if we have a relationship, it's going to continue beyond the life of the next, you know, director or whoever happens to be in place. So we've reached cooperative arrangements, MOUs with the Mackenzie Valley Land and Water Board, the Workers' Safety and Compensation Commission, the National Energy Board, the Petroleum Resources Division of ITI, and part of that is information sharing because we collect things, it might seem counterintuitive, but we collect things under the act that they administer that they're not allowed to see. And most recently, we reached an MOU with the government of Yukon, or the part of Yukon that's responsible for regulating oil and gas activity. The next slide is entitled Some of Our Successes. So I'm hoping you'll bear with me as I crow about some of these. The lack of and this is something we have to explain to people all the time. There's not any exploratory activity in our area right now. There hasn't been for a number of years. The question is, what the heck do you guys do? There's a lot of regulatory work to do. One of the things that we do, have been doing, and I'll go through these, the slide summarizes them, but I'll go through them in detail. Guidelines and interpretation notes, well watch program, transfer and digitization of files, inspections and compliance, outreach and education. I'll get into them in more detail, but again, the focus for us is trying to prove that we can regulate in a different and better way. So some of the things you're going to be hearing about are things that the National Energy Board does not do. In fact, all of the things I think that I'm listing, the National Energy Board does not do. So starting with guidelines and interpretation notes. Guidelines and interpretation notes further define and interpret legislation providing clarity to operators and the public, and they're formally issued by the regulator under Section 18 of the Oil and Gas Operations Act. So since we began, we've issued 4 guidelines and interpretation notes beginning in January 2016, and it's part of our objective of enhancing certainty and predictability in our work as well as promoting transparency. Making it crystal clear to the operators what our requirements are and also showing to the public how we regulate. So it serves a dual purpose. So we've issued the 4 guidelines since devolution. Most recent of these, the guidelines on geophysical reporting requirements, came into force in February 2018. And they set out what companies collecting geophysical information, like those that are collecting seismic, what they have to file with us and how we will treat that information, which becomes public after a defined period of confidentiality. Part of our focus on that is that there's been some court cases, one of which went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. Some companies don't like the fact that we're going to disclose information that they've collected, but our legislative regime requires it, and the courts have agreed, and that this is a public resource, information about public resource, and that it should be disclosed to the public after the defined term. So we thought it was an important area to focus on, also because it's one of the earlier steps in the oil and gas chain. Like usually people go out and collect information about the land base before they go and drill wells. So we thought logically it made sense to start there. Turning the page to Well Watch. So Well Watch is a program that we created that provides an opportunity for communities and members of the public to raise their concerns about wells that are out on the landscape. So right now there's 700 abandoned wells roughly in that green area that I showed you on the map. And most of them are completely safely abandoned, but some of them are quite old. And so we, the whole program was inspired by an experience we had with the community of Jean Marie River shortly after devolution. They'd been complaining about some wells that surrounded the community and hadn't been getting any traction with the federal government or the National Energy Board, and we thought, great opportunity to show responsiveness and find out what's going on. We went in there, Pauline and I went in there and met the chief in June, and by July we had a team on the ground with gas detectors, and some elders from the community were extremely helpful in actually locating the wells, because our location data from the NEB isn't always that great, and I'm not throwing them under the bus, but it's just a fact. Sometimes the location data we get isn't great, and so we actually diagnosed a well that had a leak on it, and we were able to confirm that there was a small leak on this well, which had been drilled in 1969. So the responsible company has now been identified and has visited the site as well. In September of 2017, we went in there with them, and there were opportunities for community members to come back in there, and the company recently submitted a plan to bring the well back into compliance. So we'd call this our sort of first success, and that became Well Watch. We thought it just made sense to publicize that. You know, the people that are best suited to notice changes on the land are the people that use the land and who are looking at it all the time. And we've had a great uptake. We've been all over the Mackenzie Valley, Clavic, Fort McPherson. I just this morning returned from Toledo, and it's being very well received to the point where the National Energy Board wants to adopt it in the ISR. So we'd count that as a success. If I can turn now to the slide entitled Orogo's Information Office. This is another function of Orogo that isn't as well known as it could be. The NEB has a function called the Frontier Information Office, and its offices in Calgary. But the function of the Information Office is to collect and make publicly available the information about oil and gas resources that has been submitted by companies conducting activities. So a company drills a well, they submit their well results to us, and then after a defined amount of time, in that case 2 years, it becomes public and other companies can look at it. One of the primary users of that information is the NWT Geological Survey when they're developing their resource models. So, but one of the things that we've taken it a step further, the Frontier Information Office, mostly that stuff is on microfiche or in hard copy. We figure we're repatriating that stuff, as the word I used to, or like to say, back to the Northwest Territories. It's not that much of a bigger step to start digitizing it and making it available on the web so that people can have easier access to it, and people can access it at the same time. You know, it's not like someone signs out a hard copy and then no one else gets to see it, like a library. Multiple people can look at that same information at the same time. So as you can see from the slide, we're making good progress on that, especially the well history reports, but that work is ongoing. And again, it's part of our objective of promoting accessibility and increasing the usability of the information for oil and gas operators and those like our scientists at the NTGS who want to get their hands on that information. They'd love to get it before the 2 years, but they have to wait the way the legislation says right now. So, moving on to inspections and compliance. So, as you can see on the slide, our inspection team has inspected all activities that we've authorized since devolution, and maybe we're in a little bit of a lucky spot there. Another thing we've done is assessed all suspended wells for compliance with our well suspension and abandonment guidelines and interpretation notes, and I'll get into that further in a moment. But yeah, despite the downturn in exploratory activity, our inspections and compliance activities have to go on. Once you've had an industry, you're going to have a certain level of maintenance regulation that needs to happen, and that's part of what we're doing. So since devolution, most of our regulatory activity is focused on the safe abandonment of previously drilled oil and gas wells. And I should have got the number. I think it's roughly 20 oil and gas wells that have been safely abandoned since since the office was stood up, which is a fairly good chunk when you're looking at there's about 90 suspended wells left. 20 of them have been safely abandoned since in the last 4 years. We also have the Cameron Hills field, the production field down near Enterprise there. It's been shut in since February 2015, and the company says that's because of the current price of oil doesn't make it economic for them to produce. But that still requires active monitoring and inspection activities, both from us and from the Land and Water Board and government inspectors, I should say. So there are approximately 90 wells within our jurisdiction that are in an inactive or suspended state. They will all need to be safely abandoned if there's no chance of putting them into production. In February 2017, we issued a guideline that set out the requirements for well suspension and abandonment and put all wells on a timeline for abandonment. And that's unique in Canada. There's no other jurisdiction that puts a timeline on well abandonment. There's some that are considering it, but we're the first one to do that. Part of the purpose of this guideline is to ensure that any outstanding company liabilities for abandonment are addressed while companies are healthy. Companies have been instructed to bring their wells into compliance with the suspension and abandonment guideline. So we expect this to drive considerable activity over the next several years. And I think you can probably read to an extent between the lines of what we're trying to get at there is that there's other jurisdictions that find themselves in trouble when the liabilities get out of control on them. So our focus is to make sure that we have healthy companies that are able to meet their abandonment obligations. The scale of any problem that we might have, and we don't have a problem right now, but the scale of any difficulty we would have is much, much smaller. As I mentioned, there's only 90 suspended wells out there. Most of them have been drilled by larger companies. That's just the nature of the work up here is it's usually bigger companies that work up here, so it's not the small guys that you see working in Alberta. But nevertheless, it's a focus for us. We can't just guess that that's the case. We want to make sure that that's the case because we don't want the government to end up with any liability. And as I said, we expect that to drive considerable activity over the next several years. So moving on to the slide, outreach and education. So as I think I went through the strategic objectives, one of ours is increasing our own capacity and the capacity of others in the NWT to regulate oil and gas activities. So we've kind of seized a role in outreach and education. We've held a number of courses, and many of them are listed on this slide: oil and gas related first aid, annual hydrogen sulfide alive training, annual workshops that we hold in conjunction with the Northwest Territory Geoscience Forum, Taming the Beast, which was we had people that came up from the Alberta Emergency Management Agency to talk about how they dealt with the Fort McMurray wildfire and the interagency response to that. So we kind of taken it upon ourselves to try and use the resources that we have to increase the capacity of others as well as ourselves. And in addition, we've been able to get out to almost all communities in the areas of the NWT that have historically been involved in the oil and gas industry. Moving on to the slide entitled Anticipated Activity. So as I mentioned, even in the absence of any new exploratory activity over the coming years, we're anticipating a relatively busy next few years. Our initial analysis of existing suspended wells under the suspension and abandonment guidelines was completed in August 2017, and we sent compliance notices out to companies that were, well, regardless of whether they're compliant or not. And the operators of non-compliant suspended wells have until August 2019 to bring these wells into compliance. And I should say that a non-compliant well could be anything from, you haven't brushed out the well enough for it to be safe enough to land a helicopter there, to you don't have two downhole barrier. You don't have a temporary plug down in your well and you've just turned off the valve at the top. You need to have two barriers, our regulations say, so things like that. There's a range of non-compliances, but we've done that assessment. So we anticipate applications for up to 32 well approvals and 5 operations authorizations. And an operations authorization is a significant piece of work to process. It's an umbrella authorization. It's subject to preliminary screening under the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act regulations. It requires collaboration with the Land Use Permitting and Water Licensing Board. So there's quite a bit of work there. And further, Strategic Oil and Gas has publicly indicated that it may pursue new development work in the Cameron Hills field as well as some abandonments, and they've made it clear that that depends on market conditions. But even if they don't do that, they will need to pursue renewal of their own operations authorization for the field to continue their operations there. And I should also say we've already got preliminary contacts with a number of operators who are planning their well abandonments in the coming years. So whether that's prompted or not by our suspension and abandonment guidelines, or whether that was something they were already planning to do is an open question, but we're just happy to see them moving that direction. Another point I'll make that's kind of interesting, especially for those south of the lake and maybe in areas where there's not a lot of oil and gas activity, but Orogo is authorization from Orogo is required for any hole drilled through sedimentary rock to a depth of greater than 150 meters, regardless of whether it's for petroleum. So if you had someone at Pine Point drilling a bunch of wells deeper than 150, they in theory needed to be coming to us for authorization. And the rationale there is that they might hit a gas pocket, so we'd have to condition that authorization in a way that would, address that until they've confirmed that there's no petroleum, unexpected petroleum in the formation. So planned activities 2018-19. So development of additional guidelines and interpretation notes. We think that this is a great and underutilized tool. If you look at the National Energy Board, and I'm not throwing them under the bus, but this is a tool that I thought that they did not utilize enough, and we have really started to use it, well, so far on an annual basis, basically. And so we're looking for other areas that we can clarify the requirements, create clarity for operators and for the public, and show what we're doing. I mean, one of the guidelines that we created was specifically targeted at being able to disclose information that the Act would otherwise not allow us to disclose. So basically going to operators and saying, can you sign off on this and let us disclose this? Some of this stuff you're giving to the Land and Water Board on this side, and they're putting it on their public registry, yet when you give it to us, we have to keep it secret because our Act says that it's privileged. So addressing inconsistencies like that, and also the expectation of people in the north that there's going to be greater transparency. Establishing and maintaining working relationships with other regulators and jurisdictions. I think we'll continue along those lines. There might be the possibility of other sort of formal arrangements. Promotion of well watch and new well watch projects in the communities. As I said, I just returned from Toledo on that project. And really continuing outreach through conferences, workshops, and community visits. When we started off, people had no idea who Orogo was. Now they have a much better idea and a lot of comfort with us, I think, which is really gratifying to those of us who've been working on it for the last 4 years. And beyond the regulatory work, we've been invited to participate in the Western Regulators Forum, which is a body of the oil and gas regulators of Western Canada, as a full partner. They don't see us as a junior partner. They'd like us to be there and occupying a seat as a full partner. We continue to work with the NWT Board Forum, which is our local boards, the Land and Water Boards, Renewable Resource Boards, Land Use Planning Boards under the MVRMA, the Canadian Association of Public Utilities Tribunals. So we try and keep apprised of all the best practices and what people are doing in different jurisdictions. In many cases, they have different legislation, but there's many good ideas out there that could be brought home and potentially employed here. So if anyone would like to drop by our office on the 4th floor of the Javaroma Tower, we always welcome that. So, thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, Mr. Fulford. Thank you for the presentation. This time I'll turn it over to committee for comments, questions from committee. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you for the presentation. I just have a few questions. You said that everything has been regulated or delegated to a ROGO. So does the minister do anything as the regulator, or have all duties and all decisions been regulated to a ROGO? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fulford.
Thank you for that question. I could have been a little more precise in describing that. So all delegable powers have been delegated to me as CCO. There's a number of powers that aren't listed in the section that allows the regulator to delegate. So among those are the ability to approve a guideline. So we can't approve a guideline in the office. I can't approve a guideline. We need to propose that guideline to the regulator and make a rationale for it, and he's the one who has to issue it. There's a number of other instances, including issuing an order to a company. I guess the answer, the way I should have expressed it is all delegable powers have been delegated to me as CCO. Thank you.
Further, Mr. Simpson?
Thank you. Question 2 of 3. So you said that Well Watch has been successful. What is success in terms of the numbers? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Fulford?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For us, success with Well Watch means a number of things. So, so far, if success is judged in terms of finding a leaking well, then there'd be one success. That'd be the Jean Marie River B48 well. We judge success in other ways. So our other goals with the program are creating greater awareness of what's out there on the landscape, creating a better relationship and knowledge of who we are. So, but we're in a sort of middle stage where we have a number of renewable resource councils, among others, who are asking questions about what they've seen on the landscape, and they're queuing up to ask us a question about it, but we haven't done further field investigations. But the first step for us would be to hear what they have to say, to review our paper files, and then to go from there. Because we have had at least one instance, I think, with the Gwich'in Renewable Resource Council, I think it was from Aklavik, where they identified what they thought was a well, but there was no well in that area. So there was some oil and gas detritus, I guess, that was there that they thought might be a well. So that's the kind of thing that the first stage where we talk to them about what we have on file.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Further, Mr. Simpson?
Yeah, and finally, I believe there's a case before the Supreme Court of Canada right now. It's the Alberta Energy Regulator, and it involves a company that I think went into receivership, and the Supreme Court is going to decide who is responsible for an abandoned well when a company goes into receivership, if that is the bank, if that's the taxpayer. And so how would that affect us, if it does fall on the taxpayer, how would that affect us in the territory? How would it affect us either way, I guess? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Fulford?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chair. It would have an effect, and you're referring to the Redwater decision. So similarly, the question would be how federal bankruptcy and insolvency law interacts with our petroleum legislation. And if there was ever a stage, and we haven't, knock on wood, reached that stage in the Northwest Territories yet, where a company wasn't able to meet its obligation, then that would come into play. So the decision, we're all carefully watching the result of that decision, and because it could potentially, if the government of the Northwest Territories was left with, trying to collect money from a company, it would determine how likely it is to actually recover that money, because it might be put further back in the queue. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Anything further from committee? Another one, Mr. Simpson?
Yeah, just a brief follow-up. Thank you. And do you have a monetary value attached to that? I think that in Alberta they said it would be about $8.4 billion. Is there any sense of what it would be in the territory? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fulford?
Mr. Chair, there are no orphaned wells in the Northwest Territories, so the value right now is zero. If you were to assume, and I wouldn't want to assume this for a moment, but that several wells were orphaned, the cost of an orphan well here isn't necessarily higher. because of access, because of higher costs, and that's about, I think, what I can say. You can imagine that the cost to abandon a well that's on the corner of Range Road 6 and someone's farm that has nice access to it, it's in flat area of Alberta, is a lot different than building an ice road across the Mackenzie and into the mountains to abandon. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Nothing further. Anything further from committee? Mr. O'Reilly?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks to Jamie and Pauline for coming in. It was a good presentation. I know it took me a long time to figure out what your real role is, and I think if people sort of think of it as a land and water board, but just with staff, rather than a board, but making decisions about oil and gas operations, not rights disposition, that's handled by ITI. That helped me sort of crystallize what you guys actually do. I guess I got a few questions, but what sort of lessons have we learned, or have you folks learned from devolution in the Yukon of oil and gas, and how are those guys handling oil and gas over there? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Fulford?
That's a very excellent and multifaceted question. So the model that they selected in Yukon after devolution is different than ours. So they decided, much like Saskatchewan, to mix their regulatory group with their rights issuance and promotional group. I can't really comment on how that's affected things. The level of oil and gas activity there since their devolution in 1998, their oil and gas devolution in 1998. They later, in 2003, they got the rest of their devolution, but in 1998, they were given, unlike the GNWT, they had a lot more time to develop their legislation. So they weren't on the 1 year mirroring scheme. So they're in some ways their legislation is more modern, if I can just put it that way. Another thing that I might raise is that they have actually had experience with an orphan well there that was re-abandoned, I think, partly at the cost of the government of Yukon. It was just across the border. I think they had to access it through the NW2, actually through the Liard. So they have that experience. We haven't talked to them specifically about that, but now we have an MOU that I think might facilitate that kind of discussion, and we can learn from each other on that kind of thing. Yeah, so those are a couple of things I can leave you with. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Further, Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, that's helpful. You had this slide with a core sample on there, and you talked about how you have this information office with, I guess, drilling and seismic results and all that kind of stuff. How did it end up with you guys and not the NWT Geological Survey? Because that's, and look, I'm not complaining, it just seems kind of odd to me that those kind of results are kept with you folks when all the other geological information that's done through mining is with the Geological Survey. So wouldn't it be better to just put it all together? But, and I just asked that. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Fulford?
Yes, Mr. Chair. I think in that case, it amounts to how the legislation treats the information. And so the samples that we collect are they're treated the same way as information. They're information provided for the purposes of the Act. So they're subject to Section 91 of the Petroleum Resources Act, which sets timelines for disclosure. So in the case of this material, the idea is that it stays with the regulator and doesn't go to anyone else. So we're collecting it, and we're not even sharing it with our geological scientists at the NTGS. So that's just the way that the regime is set up. It's unlike mining core in that, where it's not, there's no limitations placed on it, and it's for competitive reasons or otherwise. If you drill a well, the results of that well are privileged for 2 years. So even though we have people that are desperately wanting to get their hands on that core, they don't get it until the 2 years has expired. So, and it's the same thing, it basically emerged from the National Energy Board, having their Frontier Information Office. They fulfill the same role. They keep that confidential from the Geological Survey of Canada. The two offshore petroleum boards operate under much the same regime, and they do the same thing. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Further, Mr. O'Reilly?
Yeah, so just thanks for that. You folks issue the significant discovery declarations, and then it's ITI that actually issues the licenses. And the declaration doesn't actually give any rights. It's just sort of a technical issue about whether there's oil and gas to be found there in something like commercial quantities. Is that correct? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Fulford?
Yes, Mr. Chair, that's correct. So the Significant Discovery Declaration doesn't give any rights at all. And in fact, for the Significant Discovery Declaration, the test isn't commercial quantities. It's, I might have to ask Pauline for help. Significant or likelihood of sustained production. And courts have actually determined that this is actually a rather low threshold. You don't need to be flaring large amounts of gas off the top of your flare stack. It's a really relatively low. It's a likelihood of sustained production. Now, when you go on to get a commercial discovery declaration, the test is higher. But when you go into commercial discovery declaration, you're looking at going into production, and then you're out of this scheme of indefinitely locking up the resource, because then you're going into a 25-year production license in which you have to produce and you're paying royalties. So there's two tests there, but you're absolutely right that what we determine is like a scientific determination. Once the company has that, though, they can take that to ITI and say, for the portion of our exploration license that this covers, we want you to turn it into a significant discovery license. And as I recall, it's a mandatory decision for the Minister of ITI. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Further, Mr. O'Reilly?
No, well, okay, one more. Obviously, the level of oil and gas activity here is pretty low. And I'm really pleased to see that you folks have this sort of inventory of suspended wells and a schedule for their proper assessment and closure and so on. And that's really good work so that we don't turn into Alberta North. But at some point, if there's no activity, is there still a need for all of those resources? And I don't begrudge you folks doing what you have to do, because there's been a lot of learning, a lot of getting up to speed and so on. But at some point, if there's no activity, there's probably a reduced need for resources. Have you guys sort of started to turn your mind to that possibility? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Take that as a comment, but to the comment, Mr. Fulford?
Mr. Chair, we have, and I think it's over a significant time frame, but I think that no one would argue that that's not the case. Although the further point I'd make is that once you've had an industry, you're always going to have, to some degree, an industry, even if it's you have 700 wells abandoned on the landscape, and there's going to be a certain failure rate of those wells. Now, whether you need a full-scale regulator to deal with that, that's another question and not one for me to answer. But I agree with the tenor of your question. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Next, I have Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. How many non-compliant wells are in the territory at the moment? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fulford?
Mr. Chair, I don't have that number to hand. I had to carefully consider how to talk about those wells because this information is subject to privilege. But it's somewhat less than half, I believe, that have some form of non-compliance. And as I say, that can range from not brushing out your lease site to a more serious issue such as not having dual barriers in your suspended well.
Thank you.
Further, Mr. Testart?
Okay, on to this, the core sample kind of hold back, so to speak, until it's released. Is there What's the policy rationale for that? I mean, I heard that it was a holdover from the days of the Frontier office, but I mean, is there a regulatory reason why that information can't be given out earlier? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fulford?
Mr. Chair, I take that to be a question about how Section 91 applies. So that Section 91 is, it was in the legislation that we mirrored from the federal government, and it's been in the federal legislation since at least the 1970s, and I think it was geared at giving companies that took the risk of exploring a kind of a head start. So if they got beneficial well results within that 2-year period, they could then go and request a nomination and get a head start on getting more land in an area that they thought was that showed a good prospect. So that's what I think it is. When it comes to this, the seismic or the geophysical, which is given a 5-year confidentiality period, I think it's in part also to promote companies to do some speculative seismic, do seismic and hope that someone's going to buy it. So those are the kind of considerations that are wrapped up in that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Further, Mr. Testart?
Yeah, thank you. My final question is, with the budget reductions that Orogo experienced, is the regulator properly resourced? Because we have seen there's still a lot of work going on. So is it the viewpoint that you have the resources you need to do your jobs? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fulford?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that question, and I'd say yes, that we feel adequately resourced to do the job that we need to do now. Thank you.
Thank you. Further comments, questions from committee? Mr. Simpson?
Thank you. I just have a final question. The proposed changes to the Petroleum Act and the Oil and Gas Regulations, has Orogo been working with the department to provide input on that? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Fulford?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I can confirm that we were invited to a regulator-specific consultation just on Tuesday, I think it was, to give our views on the changes. Now, some of the changes likely arose partly just from discussions with us and as the primary implementer of some of this legislation, but we did have the chance to say our piece, and in the spirit of openness and transparency, we intend to post our written submission to ITI on our website to show people what we're saying should change or where they might have got it wrong. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Anything further? Mr. Simpson?
Yeah, it's good to hear the people on the ground who actually have to implement this legislation are having some sort of say in it, and I look forward to reading your submission. Thank you. Nothing further. Thank
you. Next I have Mr. Nakamayak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the presentation. I'm just looking at the map, like up in the Nunavut Settlement Region, and looking on the page where under MOUs, under your cooperative arrangements. I'm just wondering, like, does Nunavut Water Board have any affiliation with the NEB on this one, with the amount of wells that are capped off in the ISR?
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Fulford?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know that the NEB and the Nunavut Water Board have their own MOU that dealt with specifically with the downhole injection of waste into wells. That doesn't implicate us at all. And I think that the MOU occurred before the renaming of the board, so it would have been with the NWT Water Board, and I think it dated back to the days of the Mackenzie Gas Project. But I think since that MOU has become redundant due to changes to the Waters Act, the schedule to the Waters Act that says what you need a license for. So that might be too much information, but thank you.
Thank you. Nothing further? Anything further from committee? Nothing further at this time. Any closing comments, Mr. Fulford?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you again for the opportunity to brief committee. We've been looking forward to it, and again, anytime that we can answer questions, we'd be happy to come back or if it's on a one-off, please come by the office and we can go for coffee at Javaroma.
Okay. Well, thank you both very much, Mr. Fulford, Ms. DeYoung, for coming and presenting today. As I mentioned earlier, we apologize that it's taken so long. We hope that we can keep the doors open and communicate more effectively and more often in the future. Thank you for the work that you do, and with that, we can be adjourned. Thank you.